You are nothing than a beautiful shell, utterly nothing, a decorative, disposable asset, Anya's cruel smile seemed to say when Daphne was disgraced. Pierre Van Der Zee believed every relationship could be reduced to a profitable equation, and his wife's humiliation at the gala was a minor, manageable cost. His cold, logical dismissal extinguished the last ember of her hope, but sparked something far more formidable: her autonomy. When she finally confronts him, she offers a choice that breaks his entire philosophy. He realizes the one thing money can't buy is the respect he threw away. Stay with us, because what begins as an erasure ends in a reckoning. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever been overlooked and stayed silent just long enough to be heard? The air inside the Labyrinth Gala was thick with the scent of lilies and borrowed power, the kind of rarefied atmosphere where fortunes were quietly made and reputations were silently destroyed. It was the social zenith of the year, and at its center, naturally, stood Pierre Van Der Zee. He was a towering, almost predatory figure, his bespoke suit a precise sheath over an athlete's frame. His eyes, the startling color of a winter sea, were currently fixed with the intensity of a laser on a rival CEO across the marble floor. To Pierre, the gala was not a celebration of charity, but a highly formalized, high-stakes trade floor where every glance, every handshake, was an input in the calculus of success. By his side, or rather, tethered to his gravitational pull, was Daphne Van Der Zee. At 28, she possessed a fragile, ethereal, dark-skinned beauty often praised as timeless in the society columns, a quality that suited her role as the perfect accessory to Pierre's monolithic wealth. Tonight, she wore a pristine, pale gold gown that seemed spun from moonlight, a physical manifestation of the golden cage she inhabited. Her smile was practiced, a subtle, unwavering curve that conveyed distant warmth without offering any real intimacy. Daphne navigated the room with the brittle elegance of someone perpetually on the edge of breaking. Every movement was slow, deliberate, designed to withstand the constant cold scrutiny of the city's elite. Yet, if one looked closely, and few dared to look past the diamonds, they would catch a faint, perpetual shadow in her eyes. It was the fear that Pierre's affection, like his staggering wealth, was merely a loan, contingent upon her flawless performance as his wife, and subject to immediate recall should she fail to meet his rigorous, unspoken standards. Currently, Pierre was several feet away, engrossed in a discussion about a hostile takeover that promised to redraw the map of European finance. His attention was absolute. The world outside his immediate financial orbit ceased to exist. He didn't need Daphne physically near. He needed her presence, the visible affirmation of his domestic and aesthetic superiority, to hang in the air behind him like a banner of victory. Daphne, meanwhile, drifted toward the periphery of a clustered group, sipping champagne. She felt the chill of her reality. Their marriage was not a union forged in shared vulnerability, but a meticulously curated performance of power and perfection. She was the exquisitely maintained stage upon which Pierre performed his dominance. She was valuable only so long as she remained flawless, serving as the beautiful, silent anchor that allowed him to conquer the world outside. The thought chilled her more deeply than the air conditioning. She took a breath, adjusted the tiny manufactured smile, and prepared for the next wave of admirers who would praise her gown, her jewelry, and the great man who owned both. Daphne's practiced smile wavered only slightly as she settled near a towering floral arrangement, offering a moment's reprieve from the relentless social gravity of the room. She was merely an arm's length from Pierre, yet miles from his attention, which was still riveted on the potential hostile takeover. In this tiny pocket of stillness, she allowed herself one deep, unobserved breath. It was then, in that vulnerable interlude, that the predator emerged. Anya Petrova moved through the crowd with the aggressive confidence Daphne lacked. Anya was a stark contrast to Daphne's delicate presentation, all sharp angles, sculpted dark hair, and eyes that held the cold, calculating glint of someone who viewed social standing as a zero-sum game. Anya's deep-seated jealousy of Daphne's effortless position as the billionaire's wife was an open secret among the city's cognoscenti, and tonight, Anya saw her opportunity. Daphne's flawless armor was precisely what Anya needed to shatter. Anya approached the cluster of guests near Daphne, ostensibly reaching for a passing tray. Her movement was so slight, so perfectly timed, it would be dismissed as a clumsiness born of the crowd's density. As she pivoted back, the edge of her embroidered shawl snagged the stem of a heavy crystal flute filled with deep crimson Pinot Noir. The wine, a dramatic contrast to the pale gold of Daphne's gown, arced in the air with sickening slowness. Time seemed to collapse. Daphne saw the descent of the liquid, watched the deep red stain blossom across the pristine silk near her heart, a devastating, unbidden mark of vulgarity and disaster. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the immediate vicinity, a sound more deafening than any shout. The rhythmic, discreet clicks of professional cameras, the ones hired to document the night's perfection, suddenly accelerated, focused entirely on the disaster. It was catastrophic precisely because it was so minor. The amount of wine was trivial, but the public desecration of Daphne's flawless facade was everything. Her identity, the quiet, elegant wife whose presence signified Pierre's control, was instantly ruined. She felt the sudden, shocking heat rush to her neck and face, obliterating the ethereal composure she had fought so hard to maintain. The gown, her fortress, was now a public spectacle. The pale gold silk, meant to reflect moonlight, now seemed to absorb the light, highlighting the angry, growing blot of red. The spotlight that had previously celebrated her was now burning her alive, exposing her not as Pierre's perfect ornament, but as a humiliated woman standing in a pool of expensive spilled wine. Every eye in the room, pitying, malicious, or merely curious, felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. The air, once thick with perfume and power, now felt toxic, constricting her throat. The fall was complete. She stood, drenched in shame, waiting for a savior who, she suddenly realized, might not be coming. Daphne's eyes, burning with a mix of shame and disbelief, snapped across the short distance to Pierre. He was still there, the pillar of indifference, less than 10 feet away. His rival, a man named Sterling, was leaning in, gesturing at a digital presentation on a tablet. Pierre's posture was utterly immovable, his focus a solid, unbroken shield. She watched him. He had definitely heard the gasp, felt the sudden, sharp shift in the room's energy. Pierre missed nothing that happened within his sphere of influence. He had registered the commotion. The question was not if. He knew what had happened, but whether he would choose to acknowledge the humiliation of the woman he had sworn to cherish. For a torturous sequence of seconds, Daphne's entire world narrowed to the space between her ruined gown and the winter sea eyes of her husband. She didn't need him to solve the crisis. She needed him to see her, to break the facade of the ruthless financier for one brief human moment. She pleaded with him telepathically, a silent cry of, "I am your wife. I am exposed." Pierre finally shifted. He moved his head, not toward the disaster, but slightly to the left, signaling to his security detail standing at the perimeter. The slight movement was calculated, designed to manage the environmental noise without interrupting the critical flow of the negotiation. He did not look at Daphne. He did not acknowledge the crimson stain. He did not offer a gesture, a nod, or even the flicker of a concerned expression that might have cost him a single point in the current market skirmish. The multi-billion-dollar deal had won. His emotional ledger was clear. His wife's dignity was an unnecessary variable, easily outsourced or simply discarded. The realization hit Daphne with the force of physical violence, eclipsing the burn of the wine stain. She was not just stained, she was abandoned. Stripped bare of the protective shield that came with his name, she was utterly alone in the brutal, unflattering gaze of the elite. She was standing in the empty chair, the one he consciously chose not to fill. A kind, anonymous hand, the waiter's, finally pressed a white napkin into her hand, but it was too late. The damage wasn't to the silk, it was to the soul of the marriage. The judgment in the room was now aimed not at the stain, but at the man who prioritized zeros over his own wife. The moment stretched into an agonizing silence, but the silence was not truly empty. It was filled by the buzzing energy of emergent gossip. A waiter did rush forward, his face etched with genuine, immediate concern, armed with a soda water spray bottle and a small white towel. A kind, elderly woman detached herself from a nearby group, offering a soft, murmuring apology on behalf of the crowd. But Daphne barely registered them. Her attention remained locked on the figure of her husband, the man who had the power to stop the humiliation with a single step and chose to let it wash over her. The stain of Pinot Noir was already beginning to dry, turning a sticky, dark maroon, but the real damage was being etched into the collective memory of New York's high society. As the flashbulbs continued to fire, now more aggressive, knowing they had a better, more scandalous story than a simple fashion disaster, Daphne saw the shift in the guests' eyes. Their pity quickly curdled into something sharper, something aimed not at Anya Petrova's clumsiness, but at Pierre's cold-blooded neglect. The whispered words were everywhere, passing like a lethal current from table to table. He didn't even look. A hostile takeover is more important than his own wife. She's just another asset on the balance sheet, expendable. The true, public verdict wasn't about a ruined dress. It was a damning assessment of Pierre Van Der Zee's character, broadcast through the lens of his shocking indifference to his elegant wife. Daphne was merely the visible casualty of his emotional ruthlessness. With a profound, chilling clarity, Daphne understood that she could not be saved here. She could only save herself. The composure that had cracked now hardened into an unbreakable shield of dignity. She nodded once to the kind waiter, silently refusing the futile scrubbing of the silk, and turned her back on the entire spectacle. Her spine was unnaturally straight, her chin lifted high above the level of the whispers. She did not seek out Pierre, knowing the fight had already been fought and lost in the space of a frozen heartbeat. Her exit was not a flight of shame, but a defiant, resolute retreat. She walked past the velvet ropes and through the massive double doors, leaving the glittering, toxic heat of the Labyrinth Gala behind her. The pale gold gown, marred by crimson, had become a uniform of humiliation, but her unwavering stride transformed it, in her own mind, into a declaration of war. The black sedan was waiting, discreetly pulled to the curb outside the gala's service entrance. Daphne slid onto the cool leather seat, the crimson-stained silk clinging uncomfortably to her skin, a sickening reminder of the public spectacle. The car was a vault of polished wood and silence, but tonight the silence was not luxurious. It was heavy with the unspoken accusation that hung between her and the empty seat beside her. Pierre appeared 3 minutes later, sliding in without apology, without explanation, and without a single glance toward his wife or the ruined garment. He was already on his phone, the soft light illuminating the sharp planes of his face, which was still entirely preoccupied with the unfinished business from the gala. He spoke in low, clipped tones to a contact, detailing the next steps of the merger, his voice a low hum of power that filled the opulent space and utterly dismissed her presence. Daphne did not cry. She was beyond the easy release of tears, beyond the shock. Instead, a cold, hard clarity settled over her, sharpening her vision. The emotional devastation of the wine stain had been eclipsed by the logical, chilling truth of his neglect. She was consumed by the realization that her marriage was not a bond of love or even respect, but a complex, high-value business arrangement where she had just proven to be a depreciating asset. She was the perfectly polished facade of his domestic life, and tonight, the facade had cracked, yet the investor, Pierre, had merely adjusted his portfolio, calculating the minimal loss. The penthouse, 50 floors above the city's chaos, felt less like a home and more like a sterile museum of wealth. As they entered the vast, silent space, Pierre muttered a barely audible, toneless phrase about having to review documents in his study, walking immediately toward the master suite. Daphne stopped in the marble foyer. She did not follow. The idea of entering that master bedroom, that shared space, felt repulsive, like willingly returning to a crime scene. Instead, she turned and walked down the long, dim hallway to the infrequently used guest suite at the opposite end of the apartment. It was minimal, cold, and utterly neutral. She locked the door behind her, the first bolt she had drawn in their marriage. Peeling the stained silk from her body, she rejected the man, the wealth, and the flawless performance of the wife who had failed to see her as human. The following morning, the sun rose over the sterile perfection of the penthouse, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a visible metaphor for the emptiness within. Daphne was up before dawn, the sleepless night having only hardened her resolve. She did not waste time mourning in the guest suite. She dressed meticulously in a simple, sharp cashmere suit, a uniform of business, not beauty, and walked across the marble vastness to Pierre's private study. She found him exactly where he would be, seated at the center of his customized desk, 2 screens glowing, a third projecting a live stock ticker on the wall. The air in the study smelled of power and espresso. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She stood in the doorway and simply stated, "We need to talk about last night." Pierre barely glanced up, his expression a mask of professional annoyance at the interruption. "Daphne, I've already contacted the cleaner. They assure me they can handle the silk. It was a minor inconvenience, hardly worth this level of emotional expenditure." He gestured impatiently at the screens. "This is a critical morning for the Kestrel acquisition. Sterling is a shark." "It wasn't about the silk, Pierre." "It was about me," she replied, her voice dangerously level. "I was publicly humiliated, and you saw it. You chose a spreadsheet over your wife." He finally leaned back, steepling his fingers, his winter-sea eyes cold and analytical, regarding her as if she were a flawed quarterly report. "Let's examine this from a logical standpoint, Daphne. The conversation with Sterling was valued at $500 million. A 5-minute interruption, a show of chivalry, as you would likely term it, would have been irresponsible, a clear indication of a lack of focus. It would have cost us momentum, perhaps even the deal itself. You, on the other hand, had a stained dress and a momentary public embarrassment that, frankly, you could have managed with more grace. Your exit strategy was poor." His clinical, logical dismissal of her pain, framing her dignity as a trivial cost and her emotional reaction as an operational failure, did not ignite her rage. It extinguished the last ember of her hope. There was no monster to fight, only a calculator disguised as a man. His words confirmed her worst fears. She was merely an asset on a ledger, and she had just been written off. The emotional corpse of their marriage, which she had desperately hoped to resurrect, collapsed entirely under the weight of his cruel pragmatism. This was not a moment of conflict. It was the final, definitive stroke of a pen that dissolved their union. The day after the dismissal was marked by a chilling, complete silence in the penthouse. Daphne moved like a phantom, her presence surgically removed from Pierre's schedule. She immediately began dismantling her carefully constructed identity. She stopped accepting invitations to the social functions that had once dictated her life, ignoring the calls from frantic event planners and bewildered friends. Her social media, once a curated gallery of effortless perfection, went dark. She deleted the apps, severing the last visible tether to the world that knew her only as Mrs. Van Der Zee. Her retreat was not an act of surrender, but a strategic withdrawal. The vast, luxurious apartment suddenly felt unbearable, its flawless marble and towering windows simply magnifying her loneliness. Daphne realized the allowance Pierre gave her, the small monthly sum meant for personal expenditures, was the one source of income truly independent of his immediate scrutiny. She began using it quietly and purposefully, not on clothes or jewels, but on something tactile, something that demanded her focused, unseen effort. Historical preservation and restoration. Daphne had always possessed a suppressed talent for detail, a steady hand and an eye for the intricate decay of old things. While Pierre was busy acquiring companies, she was now focused on acquiring a small, forgotten art studio in a nondescript industrial corner of Chelsea. The space was grimy, smelling of dried paint and decades of neglect, but it was hers. She used a shell company name and paid the small deposit in cash, desperate for a transaction that bore no trace of the Van Der Zee signature. Inside the dilapidated studio, surrounded by chipped plaster and dusty light, she began her true work. She sourced damaged, forgotten historical documents, faded architectural plans, fractured maps, and oil-stained sketches, the kind of projects museums often deem too costly or insignificant to save. Working with quiet intensity, she spent hours meticulously cleaning, reinforcing, and bringing these unseen fragments of history back to life. She was breathing dignity back into abandoned things. Every careful brushstroke, every precisely cut piece of archival paper was an act of silent defiance. She wasn't seeking fame or fortune. She was desperate to earn something that belonged only to her, a sense of self-worth that was entirely free from the oppressive, calculating weight of Pierre's name. This secret, demanding life became her refuge, the unseen space where Daphne, the woman, could finally begin to exist, unmonitored and truly alive. Pierre initially found the domestic tranquility unbothered. The silence of the guest suite was merely a useful lack of noise, freeing him from the minor distraction of her presence. Daphne's abrupt disappearance from the social circuit was noted by his secretary, who simply canceled the necessary RSVPs for charity galas and foundation dinners. For the first 2 weeks, this arrangement was, in fact, optimal. His life, already a paragon of streamlined efficiency, was now even more frictionless. He had time to work out an additional hour, his sleep was uninterrupted, and the absence of social chatter left his focus entirely devoted to the Kestrel acquisition, which was entering its decisive phase. However, the domestic void began to create frictional drag in his business sphere, precisely where he least expected it. The charity auction Pierre needed to attend for a critical, politically sensitive client, Lord Hawthorne, suddenly lacked the necessary social lubrication. Pierre detested the soft power environment of philanthropy. He was a blunt instrument of finance, not a charming negotiator of seating charts. He found himself forced to manage the social sphere himself, fielding tedious small talk and pretending to care about endangered species funds, all while missing the invisible, effortless way Daphne had once managed these exact interactions. Her absence was turning previously smooth social transactions into grinding chores. More disturbingly, the lack of noise began to register as an enduring silence. Pierre was accustomed to her withdrawal being a brief, dramatic tantrum, followed by a predictable return to the master suite. This time, There were no tantrums, no weeping, no dramatic gestures, only an unnerving, consistent absence. His security detail confirmed she was present within the building, yet she remained utterly outside his gravitational pull. One evening, retrieving a misplaced document from the study, the silence of the marble halls pressed in on him. He found his footsteps slowing as he passed the guest suite. The polished mahogany door was closed, the deadbolt still thrown from the inside. Pierre stopped. He didn't knock, that would imply a shared reality. He merely paused, his granite jaw tightening as he stared at the simple closed door. For the first time since the gala, a flicker of something close to confusion. Or perhaps a deeper, formless fear of a loss he could not calculate entered his previously impenetrable focus. He couldn't assign a monetary value to her silence, and that made it a threat. He pressed his ear briefly to the cold wood, hearing only the distant, faint sound of classical music. Not the elegant symphonies he preferred, but something quiet, focused, and utterly independent of him. He retreated, his composure slightly chipped, carrying the unsettling awareness that the flawless asset he had acquired was no longer performing to specification. Anya Petrova, a woman who treated social elevation like a hostile takeover, recognized the void Daphne left not as an absence, but as an opportunity. The whispers around the city, first pitying Daphne, then judging Pierre, had confirmed her analysis. Pierre's emotional armor was vulnerable because his aesthetic shield, Daphne, was gone. Anya moved with surgical precision. She reactivated her philanthropy efforts, strategically donating to a foundation Pierre had only supported because of Daphne's urging. She accepted a board position on a small cultural arts committee that often intersected with Pierre's corporate legal team, ensuring their paths would cross in spaces where they could discuss serious business. At a recent venture capital summit, she managed to secure a seat at a table adjacent to Pierre's, initiating a brief professional exchange that was instantly photographed and circulated by the social press. She wasn't imitating Daphne's soft elegance. She was presenting herself as a capable, intelligent substitute, a wife who would understand the half-billion-dollar deals and never stain her silk with a costly distraction. Her calculation was flawless. Pierre needed a partner, not a princess, and Anya was ready to execute the acquisition of Mrs. Van Der Zee's former position. Miles away from the polished glass towers and the predatory social dance, Daphne was discovering a new kind of quietude in her forgotten Chelsea studio. It was a world of flaking plaster and the rich, dusty scent of aged paper, a total antithesis to the sterile, over-engineered perfection of the penthouse. Here, she wore old denim and a smock stained with glue and pigment, a uniform of honest work that felt more luxurious than any gown. She was bent over an 18th-century map of the city, meticulously applying microscopic paper fibers to repair a tear when the door creaked open, admitting a sliver of noise and a gust of cool outside air. It was Julian, a younger, charming art curator she'd met through a supply vendor who had tracked her down after seeing some early restoration work. He was all easy enthusiasm and genuine passion, possessing an intellectual curiosity that Daphne realized she hadn't encountered in years. He wasn't here for the diamonds or the Van Der Zee name. He was here for the work. Julian peered at the delicate map, his eyes wide with appreciation. The precision on this is incredible, Daphne. Most restorers rely on chemicals, but you're using time and touch. His praise was a simple, pure reward, entirely disconnected from her social rank. Julian saw the steady hand and the sharp, discerning eye that Pierre had only ever viewed as an extension of his own brand. In Julian's world, she was Daphne, the talented restorer, not Mrs. Van Der Zee, the billionaire's wife. He wasn't trying to acquire her, he was acknowledging her intrinsic value. As they discussed the complex chemistry of antique inks, Daphne laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that hadn't echoed in the Van Der Zee penthouse in years. It was in this grimy, forgotten space, with the soft light of a single industrial lamp, that Daphne realized she was finally building a life she could own, a life where her worth was determined by the beauty she created, not the man she married. The silence of the studio was the sound of her true self, finally finding its voice. The industrial space in Chelsea, once forgotten, now pulsed with a quiet, purposeful energy. Daphne, no longer the ethereal ornament of the Van Der Zee empire, moved through the grimy chic of the studio with a confident stride. Julian, his enthusiasm infectious, had been instrumental in convincing her to host a private showing. Not a society spectacle, he insisted, but a focused, intimate viewing for those who understood the painstaking beauty of restoration. The purpose was dual: to showcase the fruits of her solitary labor and, more importantly, to fund the acquisition of further decaying historical documents. Daphne, working alongside Julian, designed the evening to be an exercise in quiet taste, meticulously selecting the lighting and display cases to highlight the artifacts, not the guests. While Anya Petrova was busy courting Pierre's business partners over loud, expensive dinners, Daphne was building a reputation built on paper, patience, and palpable skill. The night of the exhibition was a revelation. Instead of crystal and chilled champagne, the air was warm, scented with aged paper and faint linseed oil. The attendees were a small, influential cohort of conservation experts, serious art critics, and discerning private patrons, people who appreciated depth over flash. Her restored pieces, a fragmented nautical chart, a series of fragile architectural drawings, a Civil War-era letter, were displayed not as grand art, but as silent, meticulously rescued fragments of the past. Daphne stood near a repaired topographical map, wearing a simple black dress that felt less like a costume and more like a uniform. She spoke not of social standing or charity galas, but of the pH balance of archival paper and the challenge of stabilizing centuries-old ink. When a renowned critic approached her, his praise was not for her jewelry but for her astonishing eye for historical detail and the uncommon steadiness of her hand. Julian watched from the side, offering a subtle, genuine smile that contained no expectation or demand, only respect. The transformation was absolute. The brittle elegance that once defined her, born of fear and performance, had been eclipsed by a quiet, earned confidence. For the first time, she was known simply as Daphne, the restorer, an identity derived entirely from something she did, something she fought for and excelled at, rather than something she was by virtue of marriage. She was radiant, not with the reflected light of Van Der Zee wealth, but with the inner glow of genuine purpose. The night ended with a significant amount raised, and far more critically, with Daphne holding a stack of business cards, not for social invitations, but for collaborations and future projects. Up in the silent penthouse, Pierre remained blissfully ignorant of the event's success. The continued silence from the guest suite was now merely factored into his routine, though he had begun to notice the subtle, professional shift in his social sphere. People, he observed, seemed less willing to laugh at his blunt jokes, and Lord Hawthorne had cancelled their second meeting. He didn't connect the friction to Daphne. He simply saw a minor, inexplicable dip in the efficiency of his world. He had no capacity to imagine the profound, self-contained victory his wife was celebrating miles away, a victory that was priceless precisely because his money could not have bought it. Daphne had finally established her own currency, and it was worth more than his entire portfolio. Weeks after the Chelsea exhibition, the whispers finally became too loud, too persistent for Pierre to dismiss as mere social static. It wasn't the usual society gossip, the kind he could safely ignore, but the sharp, professional chatter from the city's influential, cultural, and academic circles, groups he needed to impress. A prominent museum director, whom Pierre had been trying to woo for a massive donation, asked casually, "How is your wife's restoration work going?" That map piece was extraordinary. The question blindsided him. His wife's work? He ordered his assistant to quietly investigate, and the result was a sparse but devastating report. Mrs. Van Der Zee, under a pseudonym, had achieved genuine recognition in a niche, respected field, entirely independent of the Van Der Zee brand. Pierre's reaction was not concern for Daphne, but a cold, intellectual assessment of a mismanaged asset. Her success, being unmonitored and external to his control, represented a critical failure in his domestic balance sheet. He decided instantly on an intervention, a calculated effort to reabsorb her value and reassert his ownership. He drove his armored black sedan not to the sterile perfection of the penthouse, but to the dilapidated Chelsea neighborhood, a place that felt rough, organic, and utterly alien to him. He stepped inside the small brick-walled studio. The change of atmosphere was a physical shock. The space smelled of history and hard-earned sweat, not money and lilies. Daphne was there, but the woman in front of him was a stranger. She was surrounded by 3 people, Julian among them, gesturing warmly at a restored manuscript, and she was laughing, a sound that was rich, natural, and utterly free, a sound he realized he had never heard in their marriage. Her black trousers and simple cashmere sweater were utterly unadorned, yet she possessed a radiance that eclipsed the diamond-encrusted women he usually dealt with. She wasn't an accessory. She was the central, respected figure in her own environment. Pierre, the towering predator, felt himself shrink. He was the anomaly, the intruder, his bespoke suit suddenly looking like a costume of misplaced power. He cleared his throat, asserting his presence with the cold authority that had always worked in boardrooms. The small group turned. Julian offered a polite but firm smile, a look that said, "We are working here." Daphne's eyes found Pierre's. There was no fire, no panic, and no residual pain. There was only a calm, vast indifference, the expression of someone looking at a distant, irrelevant object. She acknowledged him with a slight, almost imperceptible turn of her head, then returned her attention to the manuscript, continuing her technical explanation to Julian as if Pierre were a noisy appliance in the corner. The casual, absolute dismissal was a mirror image of his own ruthless indifference at the Labyrinth Gala months prior. He had chosen the spreadsheet over her. She was now choosing her self-worth over him. Pierre, standing abandoned in the dust motes and honest light of the studio, finally understood what loss felt like. The silence of the penthouse after Pierre's bewildered return from the studio was not the echoing void of absence, but a dense, settled silence of conclusion. His usual response, to rage, to calculate, to immediately pivot to acquisition, was paralyzed by the simple fact that he had nothing to acquire. He found Daphne waiting for him in the vast, sterile living room, standing by the soaring window that framed the city. She was not a wife anymore. She was an executive waiting for a deposition. Daphne did not seek revenge. She had bypassed that petty impulse entirely. What she craved was far more valuable: autonomy. She spoke first, her voice calm and stripped of all residual hope, sounding like an attorney outlining a closed contract. "I have relocated my belongings from the master suite. This meeting is to define the new terms of our arrangement." She allowed him no space to interrupt or default to his usual dismissal. "I do not require your permission, only your cooperation. I have established my own foundation in Chelsea, and I have earned independent contracts. I am no longer financially dependent on your perception of my utility." Pierre stood motionless, leaning against a cold marble pillar, the picture of a man who had misplaced $1 billion bond. He tried to reclaim authority. "This is absurd, Daphne." I will fund your studio fully, immediately. Come back to the social circuit. We'll host a major fundraiser for your restoration work. We can respin this. Her gaze was clear, unwavering, and deadly. You still don't understand. You treat everything as a PR problem to be managed. The problem is not my public image, Pierre. It is the fundamental structure of our relationship. It died the night of the gala when you chose your spreadsheet over me. The public humiliation was momentary, but your choice was definitive. She then presented the options, laying them out like a merger agreement. Option 1 is a quiet, amicable, and immediate divorce. I ask only for the funds necessary to secure my studio and my work, nothing more. Option 2, she paused, letting the weight of the second choice settle, is a new partnership. A marriage where my work, my time, and my person are respected as entities entirely separate from your corporate identity. It requires an honesty and an emotional investment that, frankly, I doubt you possess, but it is the only way we continue. Pierre, the master negotiator, had no leverage. He saw the cold, brutal truth in her eyes. She had already left the golden cage and was merely offering him the key as a courtesy. He finally confronted the failure of his entire philosophy, the belief that money could purchase value, loyalty, and dignity. He had calculated the cost of every luxury, yet he had utterly discarded the single most valuable non-monetary asset in his life. The sincere love and admiration of a person who had seen him as more than his wealth. That respect, once lost, could not be bought back at any price. He looked at the woman he had married and saw a self-possessed stranger of steel. I need time to consider the financial implications of option 1, he finally managed, his voice hollow. Daphne simply nodded, accepting his answer as a predictable procedural delay. The clock is no longer yours, Pierre. I will be staying at the studio. She turned and walked toward the apartment's massive double doors. She did not look back at the marble, the view, or the man who stood alone in the center of his own vast, cold empire. Daphne, the restorer, had completed her most important work. She had restored her own self-worth, and she walked away free finally to determine her own value. If this story of calculated indifference and quiet strength moved you, share it. Someone you know has stood in Daphne's pooling crimson shadow and needs to be reminded that grace isn't weakness and silence doesn't mean surrender. Comment below if you've ever been made to feel small and rose anyway. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.